Wonderful day, everyone. Good to see all of you here. I'm so glad you're here with us today. So, I want to introduce everyone to our speaker for Unit Masters Week 3. We are like at 50% of our Unit Master 6 weeks program for blockchain literacy. First week, we spoke about decentralization and the Internet of Value. Second week, last week, we basically looked at the ecosystem from a bird's perspective. We learned about how investors look at the ecosystem. We had a talk with IBM's Nitingar about the future of internet and the internet, like money, the concept of money in the internet. And today, this week, we're focusing on governance mechanisms, proof of stake mechanisms this Thursday. And today we're going to speak about governance and what does it actually mean. And we have with us today Vlad. Vlad is actually a very well-known researcher for his work in the proof of stake ecosystem, thinking about different ways of consensus and how actually can you come to consensus in a world in which there's no central party, not only in the technical side that we will speak about it on Thursday, but more on the social side. I'm very happy to welcome Vlad and everybody. Please write your questions into the chat and then we'll pick them up in a little bit. And Vlad, would be super amazing if you could share with us, your thoughts about what does governance in Web3 actually mean, and how can we actually think about it holistically? Where are the pitfalls of what people think about today? What are the myths, the myths? I know you have very distinct opinions about on-chain versus off-chain governance, and yeah, the stage is yours, and then we'll pick it up from there. Thank you so much for making it at 5
Sure.
a.m. the morning your time.
Yeah, I mean, when I agreed to this, I thought I would be in Europe. And I just had to change of plans. But my pleasure, and happy to be here. And thank you so much for inviting me. I would love to talk about Web3 governance, and also crypto law. And so basically, the reason why I say is because governance discussions are often sort of tied at the hip with legal discussions. And it's very hard to think about governance without also bringing in the concept of disputes that occur in governance. And basically, law and governance really, kind of go hand in hand. It also goes hand in hand with other things like politics. But I think, focusing on Web3 governance and then kind of going in and trying to also provoke a little bit of a legal conversation, I think. I guess I'll try to talk for 15 minutes so that we can have a Q&A after. Basically, governance is all about decisions and how people make decisions and how people should make decisions. Governance has a lot of different kinds of language associated with it, including the language of due process, legitimacy, democracy, accountability. There's basically a kind of a vernacular of governance that we use to talk about decision making, and in particular in the context of resources that are shared and when the decision affects other people. Normally, people don't talk about the governance of deciding to brush your teeth in the morning. People talk about the governance of a shared common resource, or a resource that impacts other people. People make decisions every day, all day, but that's not to say that they govern every day, all day. It depends on who. I mean, some people do, but governance is really about sort of making decisions that affect other people, and in which you basically have this political and legal responsibility, where basically you're determining sort of how people will be organized and how people will fight about stuff and what outcomes people are going to get. Maybe not, every time you're doing governance, but these are some examples of the things that come up sometimes. In Web3 governance specifically, we're talking about governance of protocols, governance of infrastructure, governance of standards, governance of trademarks, governance of things like, for example, capital, shared treasuries, shared software repositories that may be about sort of any number of things. The key thing about sort of Web3 governance and Web3 politics and law is that it's meant to be decentralized. It's meant to be something that is hard to take over from an adversarial outside perspective. You know, crypto law and blockchain governance are sort of set up to stop people from attacking the system from like sort of every level. And there are norms that sort of dominate this arrangement today that probably aren't going to last forever. And so blockchain governance and crypto law and Web3 governance, crypto law are basically in a very, very early stage of development. The way we govern protocols today is nothing like we're going to do in 20, 40, 100 years. Specifically, the norm that dominates today is this norm called blockchain immutability, where the protocol is meant to be sort of a technical artifact that is above or outside of social decision-making in terms of governance, law, politics, morality, et cetera, at least to the maximum extent that it's supposed to be, that it could be. So the dominant norm today in crypto law and blockchain governance is basically governance minimization is the frame of it. Basically the idea that governance is supposed to be a problem and therefore should be minimized, and therefore somehow the positions of authority, the important decisions, the political considerations, legal considerations, moral considerations that are made in decisions that affect our protocols, our shared infrastructure, et cetera. We understand in crypto today, broadly speaking, this is the dominant norm, that we should minimize any governance that's required. Sometimes people will even say something like, blockchain, if it's blockchain, doesn't need to be governed. Or there's memes like this where basically that essentializes immutability, where basically if you have a blockchain without immutability, isn't that just a database? There's all sorts of ways in which people will try to argue that if you have governance, then you're going to have basically a decision-making system that gets captured by some political powers, and therefore, sort of compromises the security system for everyone else. So this norm of governance minimization, immutability, is basically like a dominant norm, and unfortunately for sort of everyone, it's like not good governance. It's very, very bad governance actually to sort of say we're going to minimize our governance, because it's not coherent. It doesn't actually make sense, in the sense of like, if governance is like about good decision making, like minimizing good decision making, okay, or if it's something about sort of how decisions are made, I mean, you can't really minimize how decisions are made. I mean, it's sort of like it's like not a quantitative thing. It's not like there's like less decisions made or more decisions made. Even that's like sort of making a decision. And in particular, one way to think about it is, if you just say you're never going to change it, then that means it's like you give outsized power to people who specified it at the start, because like they had all the agency, and then afterward you weren't allowed to change it, basically. And so, even when you try to say, okay, like it's a trustless solution because there's governance minimization, I mean, that ends up being kind of false, and you end up having to trust the founders a lot more, because like their sort of will got reified into the protocol that you're not allowed to change. And so like founder power is extremely high in Web3 and in blockchain as a result, much more than in like traditional startups. And this is something that is like sort of an aberration given the decentralization norm. But because of immutability as a strategy for protecting crypto and like Web3, founders have a tremendous power and influence and ability to sort of internalize economic benefits also. So the sort of like economics, that come out of this governance norm also are very, very much like, only finite number of coins, get it while supplies last, like people who have it earlier have the crazy returns compared to people who have it later. And it kind of is very much to do with this norm, because the issuance of cryptocurrency is supposed to be basically banned completely by blockchain governance minimization, because you're not allowed to change these things. And so basically you have to sort of pre-commit to how many tokens there are going to be as a norm, pre-commit to how the tokens are issued as a norm. And so, and that really does favor tremendously early decision makers who determine the initial token distributions or things like this. And so basically, blockchain governance in crypto a lot today sort of ironically centralizes power in founders and kind of disenfranchises lots of people. You know, it's supposed to be permissionless, and which is supposed to mean that you don't need permission. But what it really means is that like no one has permission except for like the people who are there early, who basically are gone now, or who aren't there to be responsible anymore. And so it's like a kind of radical denial of authority that like ends up being disenfranchising as opposed to empowering because of the lack of enforcement, for example. Because it means that like when you need something, you can't have it. You know, you want to change the protocol. You know, you have to basically be prepared to fight a lot of people. So like in practice, blockchain governance is all about convincing people that changes are necessary and that they are, if you don't have them, that there'll be something critical and bad that happens, and therefore that you can make it through this threshold of minimization. That like, despite our norm that we don't do anything, we really need to do this because X, Y, Z, if we don't, it's gonna be a disaster. And so a lot of blockchain governance is sort of agitating around decisions in order to get people to accept that we shouldn't have a decision at all. And this kind of has to do with a lot with blockchain immutability and the sort of minimization in crypto law. And I think the main reason why people are like this is because it limits their liability today. Basically, by saying that it's not their responsibility, not their authority. Basically, they can say, "Look, it's not my fault," and you can't really get in trouble if no one's allowed to do it and you're not allowed to do it, you know, for not doing it. And so there's a kind of sort of like a right to or like even an obligation to be negligent that is created by blockchain immutability. I just saw like a chat message popped up that's interesting, and I think listening actually as part of communication and governance is one of the most important things in terms of making sure that people aren't disenfranchised. And it's like a critically important thing, and probably one of the most important things in any organization or any kind of governance or politics or law is like, listening to people and understanding where they're coming from. But that sort of starts to get us actually to like much more sort of relevant governance norms than the ones that dominate crypto today. Basically, there's a kind of governance norms that are very well established in the world today, including, listening to people, including being accountable to them, understanding who the stakeholders are in your decision, and making sure that you are trying to represent everyone's interests in decision making. There's basically a kind of, I would say, a big sort of problem in governance discourse today, even outside of blockchain and crypto, which kind of is addressed really directly by this listening thing, but also by other social science that can't be addressed in a technical way. So basically, there's a problem of people imagining that governance is like a system, is literally a system, and that we make decisions according to a process, and that we have to have pre-specified before how we make a decision, which is basically like totally not true. Like governance is nothing like systems and nothing like processes. The only sense in which there are processes is in the sense that like things end up happening. It's not like there's a pre-committed process by which things happen. Every decision is fraught with context and particular circumstance, and you cannot reduce governance to a system. You can't really govern according to a system. Systems can't govern. Whenever people try to assume that they can describe governance in terms of a system, what they're basically doing is they're making an analogy to structure, like mechanical structure, mechanical computers, digital systems, computer systems, and trying to say, look, like, everything is information, right? Like everything is physics, right? Like we can understand governance as if it's like a machine. And this kind of is a doctrinal analytical mistake. And any time you see any governance language that basically assumes that governance is like a system or a structure, you can replace that language with something better. And the effects are like immediate and sometimes shocking. So let me just taste the water and give some examples. So, the classic one is voting systems. So people think about voting systems in the context of Web3, in the context of democracy, broadly speaking, as if, by voting in a system, you can actually express yourself, be heard, participate in governance, not be disenfranchised. And as a result, people are disenfranchised based on the fact that they have a vote. And so, we don't need to listen to you plebs because you voted, and this is what you wanted, this is what you chose. And, there's no kind of there's almost no democracy if the only say you have is a vote in a system. Because how do people rule if they're not really listened to as sort of humans, and instead they're listened to as if they're participants in a machine, as if they're, hitting a button and trying to influence the machine to go left or right altogether in this collective sort of structural consensus protocol where you kind of all put your inputs and we try to get to this consensus outcome. It's sort of deeply disenfranchising to be reduced to have your whole human experience of how you're affected in governance and to have to express that through a participation in a system. And so, this sort of critique of voting systems as basically not democratic is something that I think is super powerful and something that people don't really understand well enough in crypto or in say most democracies. And the reason for this norm is basically because of during the Enlightenment, when the concepts that underpin our Western democracies were sort of conceived, they committed this fault that I just talked about of imagining that we could govern ourselves with the system, and therefore this idea of a voting system being super important to democracy sort of was it was older than that, but that's where it kind of got entrenched into our modern sort of context of thinking about democracy. And I guess it wasn't it's sort of I mean, I'm not a historian. I might be getting the precise era wrong, but basically the Enlightenment gave us the structuralist thought that eventually led to the structuralist democracy that we enjoy today, or that enjoys us today. So there's basically lots of really great and lots of really horrible governance norms also in sort of governance outside of crypto and blockchain. And we sort of would do well to do a review, comparative analysis, understand what kind of works in what context, what we could expect to work in our context, and what we can expect to be a disaster in our context. And I think that the main thing that I would stress is that what we can't afford is to have a crypto law state, a Web3 state that has global authority over protocols that are ubiquitous in nature and that they can go basically anywhere where people have computers. And that kind of sort of ubiquitous authority doesn't really play well legally with other sort of let's say states and corporations. So basically we have you can imagine if you imagine, so I mentioned earlier we shouldn't imagine that we make decisions according to a system or a process. We also shouldn't imagine that we constitute a person that makes a decision also, as if we have a body politic that us together make a kind of corporation or a state that and we have the authority to make decisions ultimately because we are sort of the sort of together the person that governs. And so this idea of okay, we have a system that governs is like problematic because it creates this like global authority structure. But it's always the idea that we are together the person that governs, because it creates like this global sort of jurisdiction state type apparatus where basically like the person, like crypto law or Web3 state, sort of has absolute unquestionable authority in determining these protocol changes, because like they're the one who decides in this sort of frame of governance, sort of absolute authority. And so, I think rather than to imagine that we can sort of never change it, only change it to the system, or change it as if we were like a one person governing it, it's all sort of very naive, very problematic, like will never work sort of level of governance thought. I think like if you want to have sort of a reasonable a chance at blockchain governance that isn't super hazardous for everyone, you basically need to understand in context the ways in which people are going to have and be affected by a particular decision. And that's going to include people from inside and outside the community. It's going to basically include a sort of contentious process often, where we kind of talk about how everyone's going to be affected and try to see whether things are going to actually be a good decision or not. And when you are subject to dispute constantly from lots of sources, when you imagine the way you would affect people and try to not get in trouble with them, when you sort of are subject to governance and the rule of law, as opposed to imposing it with ultimate authority, you end up having like a much more legitimate posture. And so as opposed to trying to say, okay, look, we have these rules, systems, norms, this like personhood, and we decide, saying, look, here are like all sorts of considerations for that we could have for to represent the interests of all the people who might be affected. And we consider ourselves sort of as like a subject, serving them, doing our best to be sort of not dominant in a ruling position, but serving in a position of like, sort of like doing the best for others, understanding that we have sort of, even when we don't have accountability, that we have a duty towards other people, and a duty to global law and to global governance in a very broad sense. And so with a kind of like less, let's say, authoritative posture, we can have like a much more legitimate posture that basically gives sort of us less power, it seems, but it does completely empower us, because it makes us secure. Where something like trying to be ultimate authority or to make an ultimate authority, is a much less secure posture, actually, because it's irresponsible and unresponsive. Basically, in law and governance in general, the only secure posture, unless you're in a position of sort of that like doesn't exist anymore, you basically need to be sort of locked in a non-deterministic dance with all the other institutions and people in the space. And so there's like a kind of ecosystem, like sort of dynamic, sort of like equilibrium, that it's not even an equilibrium, it's more like everyone sort of keeping track of each other, and like sort of like, I want to say dancing, but basically like in a kind of relational order that is really responsive to each other's positions. And so if someone acts all of a sudden like they're never going to change, everyone else has to change, and that's sort of like not just rude, but it's not reasonable to expect given the sheer number of bodies actually involved in this dance. And so in this sort of like like legal governance, politics sort of discussion and context, if you try to say, oh, here's my absolute certainty, that ends up being like, someone who, or something that is basically like not dancing to the beat, not understanding the risks, basically not secure. In fact, the only way to sort of like have security in these settings is to admit not knowing, and to admit needing to change possibly based on new circumstances, and including based on like other people's demands and other people's desires, and so the only really secure postures are basically very sort of non-deterministic postures that are willing to handle a lot of uncertainty. You need to basically be prepared to change in order to not change, because like if you're not prepared to change, you're just threatening everyone, and that's weird and not like a vibing posture, and then people will basically like treat you accordingly, basically because you're a liability. And I think blockchain suffers from this like being treated as a liability because of the refusal to change. And I think one day blockchain governance, Web3 governance, etc., will be sort of much more respectful, much more a much more peaceful member of the overall ecosystem, as opposed to sort of being like it is today, kind of aggressive, insecure, and sort of very naive. But I mean, you never know. These things are deterministic, but that's sort of like the sort of expected outcome given the way that like law and governance and politics like actually works. And so I think that our like we have like a big need and sort of obligation to accept that we can't sort of govern ourselves in a vacuum, that we need to be open to other people, to listening to other people, to understanding sort of our context in a broader context, rather than to act like we're like the center of the world from which like decisions sprout or whatever. There's kind of a big opportunity in crypto to meet governance standards and to meet much higher governance standards than are like normal in like the broader world. And not only do we have that sort of as like an opportunity, it's also sort of an obligation, because we're claiming that like we know how to organize the world better, like that we're going to do a better job of figuring out how things should be done, and also because of like the sort of just the fact of being like the new kids on the block, like being sort of a new global solution. We really have an obligation to show that like our way is better than existing ways, and that really means taking governance and legal and political sort of thought sort of much more seriously than we do now, and also just being much more responsible than we are now, because basically bad, unlawful, politically incorrect decisions will have impacts that undermine our legitimacy and are like the utility of the services, and basically our ability to manage commercial disputes, like you name it, you kind of can go down the list, and it's all really degraded by bad governance and crypto law. And so I think the proper way to think about like governance in Web3 really is basically it's the proper way to think about governance, but applied to this particular scope. And the only sort of the only sort of like qualification for that is that blockchain Web3 is revolutionary, and revolutionary politics, law, and governance are a little bit different than just like a establishment governance, law, and politics. You basically are when you're part of like a revolutionary movement, you can't say, oh, we need to like be in line with existing norms, because that's not revolutionary. We have to also push and be a little bit more sort of in line with our political ethos in order to have legitimacy in our own space. We can't just say, oh, we need to comply with previously existing standard traditional ideas. Instead, we have to say, like our governance and law and stuff is like not only better, but it's like cypherpunk as hell, and it's like it's something where that's like it should be inspiring to people who sort of are disempowered and disenfranchised by the system. And so there's this sort of problem of how do you take sort of like the radical revolutionary politics of like the blockchain revolution, and also like everything we know about law and governance and politics so far, and basically not do something in order to prevent us from doing something sort of like really dumb with our revolution and basically failing or accidentally paving the way for some dystopian kind of success.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. Well, maybe you can share with us in which way should we seize the opportunity that blockchain provides to, like, role model a different way of governance that can then be applied or adopted by other parts of outside of the industry. I haven't quite understood what would be a good way to move to that world that you would
Yeah.
deem a better world.
Well, I mean, there's lots of unique things that cryptocurrency and blockchain and like Web3 and crypto and all this sort of matrix of stuff has. There's a lot of like unique things that it has in particular that aren't common in these like more traditional governance settings, which make it sort of unique, give it like sort of a uniquely like better position to solve certain problems that are really difficult.
Yeah.
And so I think that we should play to our strengths and use the things that are like unique to our space in order to make decisions in ways that are sort of innovative.
Yeah.
I think it's like the number one easy thing to say is like, oh, okay, we can use our tools to do things that like before weren't possible, and we can sort of using crypto, blockchain, etc.
Yeah.
Do things like, for example, more accountability, more verification, more funding public goods, things like this.
Yeah, do you want to share a few use cases? Because ultimately we are still in this very early stage of blockchain literacy in this course. And maybe you can share one or two of your favorite examples of how we can actually think about public goods. Like, why is blockchain or crypto so beneficial for coordinating decision making, for example, or dispute resolution in the public goods area? Do you have any examples?
So the key thing is that basically like these protocols are sort of public protocols that we can govern as if we're sort of governing some shared resource, but they allocate and describe the ways that crypto assets work. And those assets can, for example, be used to pay people and that is sort of really a radical thing from the point of view of public goods, because basically normally a public good like won't be able to pay for itself. I mean, that's sort of like the problem economically, is that public goods are sort of hard to get people to have an incentive to pay for. And so the sort of ability of creating a public good that creates money, like not quite money, but cryptocurrency, is something that is like already a big new thing. Unfortunately, we've been sort of like denied the right to use that by the blockchain immutability norm. But like that is like the biggest thing, is like basically the fact of the protocol having money, I mean, or cryptocurrency is the sort of the biggest thing. And if there's something else, I think it's the sort of the way in which the immutability norm, even though it's not very good, the way it was associated with the technology in a way that made it sort of a part of the technology. And that sort of trick, the trick that like had blockchain become immutable, is like a trick that like's never been done before. It's like a crazy out there association of legal doctrine with legal politics, governance doctrine with technology, which we still have very tightly associated, but which has had a tremendous, unprecedented impact on like global law and politics. And so this is the sort of ability to associate political philosophy, legal philosophy with technology, and to have it be, dramatically impacting the way that people use it, is tremendously powerful and tremendously important. And even though immutability is a horrible thing, the idea, the concept, the tactic, the governance tactic that was pulled off was incredible, and something that will be replicated over and over again with various goals. I think when people you know, sort of figure out that this is sort of like something that happened.
Yeah. What do we still have to figure? Like I'm trying to and then you think of the evolution of governance as a human life. Which phase of the human life would we be in, and what is the next big thing that we need to move towards? Are we now in the baby stage? Are we more in the
Yeah,
teenager stage?
we're like pre-empathy still, like very young toddler, like, you know, like before really recognizing that other people have like sort of you know, like it's sort of like, you know, we're like a terrible 2-year-old, you know, like, or a terrible 3-year-old who like will like terrorize their parents and never like, and like will like never give up their like weird capricious sort of desire and demand. And so, you know, I think we're very much like a 2-year-old or 3-year-old, basically like very young, very irresponsible, very much aggressive and demanding and tolerated, but, you know, because we're so cute and young, not because like anyone likes our behavior.
Yeah. So what do we still have to learn in terms of like better use of technology? I actually not quite sure how to understand the challenge that we need to solve next. Is it just like becoming more mature as participants in the ecosystem, or what do we still lack to develop? Tooling or understanding or mechanisms, or is it just about understanding the philosophy better? What's your
Yeah,
take?
I mean, it's sort of all of the above. I mean, and more. I mean, it's we basically like, you know, there is of course the understanding and also the disciplines of participating in governance, but really it's like there's like a lot of institutional stuff, culture stuff, you know, stuff to do with like sort of like the history and like the things that have happened, and it is really hard to sort of just with doctrine, just with discipline to govern or to fix governance or to address problems in governance. You know, there's a certain kind of activism or interventionism or action that's necessary. You can't sort of just practice or just think. You have to actually do. And so there's a kind of like, you know, obligation to actually like engage in good governance that like can't really be solved by just like a doctrinal recognition. And so I guess like the main thing is like, I guess we need to take responsibility and you know, uphold our duties and be sort of good, not just in like a very narrow sense, but like in this very broad sense of like responsibility. And I guess like, you know, not everyone has the same or needs to have the same relationship to governance or responsibilities. But like broadly as a space, you know, I think like we need to sort of like be more responsible, and that's like the number one simple thing to say. Yes, understanding will help. Yes, better discipline will help. Yes, you know, but it's not going to be sufficient as like actual practice, and not, you know, in the sense of like you know, interacting with governance and making decisions and sort of like, you know, experiencing basically what it's like to argue about protocol changes, to argue about token distributions and all the other things that end up being critical arguments in crypto, Web3, etc.
Yeah. What would like a head of state need to study in order to understand how to make best use of blockchain technology for the well-being of their, I don't know, their territory of governance?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's like a risks and opportunities kind of approach where basically like, you know, you need to understand the risks and the opportunities in order to like navigate. But I would say that the conceptual foundations for understanding this stuff hasn't really been laid. And so, you know, actually like participating and seeing it and feeling it is relatively more useful. Although now that I mentioned that, actually like there is actually like still a lot of sort of basic conceptual work that is important in governance. Actually, there's a lot of agency that, you know, like that is given to, you know, people who come up with basic conceptions that end up dominating governance, even if they didn't mean to, even if they couldn't have known that they would be adopted. There's kind of like a conceptual framing of stuff that basically is very important in governance, politics, and law. Although, and it's something that like, you know, it's never going to be governance, politics, or law, but the way people imagine stuff influences the way they participate in it. And so I would just say, like, you know, the paradigms for a head of state to reason about their relationship to crypto just don't exist. And like some political philosopher somewhere, some is going to need to write that and understand that and conceive of that. And you know, there's like going to be like a, you know, it could be any number of like types of styles of political philosophy, but it's something that, you know, basically today we basically have to say, you know, like, here are some risks and opportunities that we know about. Like, you know, you might have others, like, you know, please consider yourself in the context, you know, and it's sort of like more of a like sort of like, it's more like ad hoc national interest than it's something like sort of like a, you know, like there's no like a you know, official diplomatic protocols or anything like this. I mean, like as an example, but I'm not really sure, you know, how to best support authorities in dealing with crypto law, other than to say, okay, well, you need to protect your national interests, and you need to understand that the crypto law is like sort of an international legal form, and also it's not even just international, but it's like exists in this world of this crypto like cyberspace sort of world, which is like in a different kind of space than national space. And so it's not just like international, it's like cyberspace, it's like crypto, it's like new kind of crypto space. And so I think, you know, understanding like the national, international side of side of the picture is like, you know, definitely important and a good starting point. But you know, and that's something that like it is conceivable, but how they should participate in crypto law and cyberspace, I mean, that's much harder to conceive of, basically because of the very different nature of the sort of the law. I mean, like, you know, like these authorities that we're talking about are international law authorities. They're not cyberspace authorities. They may have like some authority in cyberspace because of the nature of like cyberspace being like on top of physical space, but they're not like, that's not their sort of space really. And like, and you know, there's lots of spaces actually in governance and law and politics that are not ruled in this way by international law, and or where international law is failing to rule in that way. And so you know, there's a sort of need also to recognize that they can't solve the problem and they can't necessarily help us, and we need to sort of figure out, without, you know, appeal to sort of head of state style authority, how to manage our disputes, decisions, politics, etc.
Well, yeah, I think there's a lot to learn still. It's like really grounding us to knowing and feeling empowered that we are still in a very young stage of the industry, of the development, and all of you who are actually here are vital or will be vital contributors to shaping the space as it matures and connecting, thinking the thoughts. In Unit Masters, we care very much about a critical systemic view of the ecosystem. That's why we invite people like Vlad here, people who've been in the space for a long time, who shared their own perspective because they have thought about the space, thought about how to build it, how to contribute to shaping the world that we hopefully all enjoy living in the next years to come. So thank you very much,
Mm-hmm.
Vlad, for
But
waking
wait a
up
second.
early. Huh?
Could I address some of the questions in the chat before we go?
Oh, I just wanted to not keep too much of your time, but of course, please do.
Yeah, I just haven't really been following them, and now that I see them, I would like to. Let me just go from the bottom up.
Yeah,
So I
please
totally
do.
agree about the you know, the tech focus being a problem. My only real feedback about this comment is that like social sciences are, even the term social science is already kind of trying to make sociology into a science, and I think that's kind of problematic. But you know, sociology I think is a great term social science I find suspect because it appeals to science where it should just be sort of like more sociological and less scientific. Do I share Vitalik's statement? No. I mean, I don't think Ethereum is neutral. I don't think Vitalik's neutral on the particular Russia-Ukraine issue. I think, it's definitely like something where, like, obviously, like, Ethereum, Vitalik doesn't represent Ethereum in like for everyone in this way. This is like a politically very current and issue, and I think that's but it's definitely true that he's not neutral, but it's not true that Ethereum isn't neutral. I mean, just because it's not taking sides doesn't mean that it's neutral. So the smart contract.
Wait, can you elaborate on that? Just because it's not
Sure.
taking sides, it's not neutral. What do you mean by
Yeah.
that?
So basically, neutrality is the idea that, like, sort of you don't have sort of like it's sort of like an outside, like, not participating in the conflict type of party. Imagine if you're participating on both sides of a conflict. I don't think that that's considered neutral, right? That's sort of like partial to both sides. It's not like objective or somehow outside the system. It's like very much inside and very much, sort of involved. I would say like this. Neutrality is basically like objectivity and impartiality, a sort of something that it doesn't really exist. It's something that, like, is used, but is like sort of politically, legally, like sociologically, sort of not like even historically, like just not a fact. Because everyone's embedded in a context. There is no veil of ignorance. You can't. That experiment isn't like real. No one's able to suspend with their embodied judgment and context when making decisions, and that goes for institutions, protocols, etc., not just people. So I mean, I just don't think like neutrality is like a thing, like just like objectivity or impartiality. Like, it's not sort of not a real thing. It's something that, like, is supposed to exist by, like, sort of philosophers from a long time ago, but, like, it's not something that, like, is very. I mean, people, like, I think enough people have figured out today that that's, like, not a real thing. So is that clear, or should I go to can I go to the next one?
Yeah, let's go. Yeah.
So basically, smart contracts are basically like computer code. You might have some security protocol in there, but fundamentally it can't really infer intent or do the kind of, like, investigative sort of work that is necessary to determine, when someone is making an action in a criminal way or just in an honest way, because of the context and intent that's involved in making that kind of determination. So, smart contracts basically are means of, like, sort of they're more like securities or security mechanisms than contracts or contract law, and they're more like like a sort of procedural thing than a thing with, like, real judgment. And so it's just not the thing that can ever secure governance. And so basically, like, smart contracts don't and can't govern. They might be part of an ecosystem and sort of be, like, useful in that context, but ultimately, like, they're not going to be the ones exercising judgment, and they're not going to be the ones governing. So smart contracts basically, like, not really going to be able to protect governance in this way. How do you keep up with everything in order to stay in context in this, like, like trying to basically just keep up with the dance that is like politics and law. And, that's really tough. I mean, basically, the way that you need to do it in practice is to become sort of part of the context and to stay in sync through not just constant information, but more in terms of sort of non-doctrinal participation. It's very hard to, from information, figure out how to move. You need to have like a kind of, information is important, but you need to have like some more direct observation, some less mediated interaction, some more, you need to actually like listen to the beat. You can't just learn about it. Like imagine knowing all the music theory in the world, but like never listening to music. I mean, it would never work for you to dance to the beat, and you need to like, so not only do you have like experience dancing, but you need to, yes, you should have like some theory, but like for the most part, you don't need a ton of information. What you need is like, a ton of context, experience, and in interactive sort of, as opposed to individual practice. Simulation-based governance. That's, there may be some cases where simulation is important to show what a decision would do. However, and it may be even predictive in many cases to simulate like sort of like governance as a kind of negotiation between people with various amounts of stake or very amounts of weight in this negotiation. However, the idea of predicting governance and using that to do governance is itself sort of, so it's a little absurd because basically you can't predict without factoring in your own agency. And so by trying to make an impartial prediction, objective prediction, as if you're not part of the system, in order to participate in the system, it's kind of potentially very bad faith, because you could accept and predict bad outcomes without, and then feel like you can't participate to change them, and therefore sort of neglect your duty to intervene to prevent this outcome. So basically, like the prediction without factoring in your own agency, which is basically, not all prediction, but most of the time when people are like talking about making prediction and governance, they're thinking, what is going to happen, without thinking, what is going to happen because, or what am I going to make sure will happen, or like, sort of like what future do we want, what's legitimate, and having the good faith to assume that that legitimate outcome will happen because of one way or another. And so the problem with simulation-based governance is the inability to simulate legitimacy and inability to recognize the duty to seek legitimate outcomes, even when it's apparently not in the deck, not in the cards for governance right now. So I think there's a kind of like, like breaking the cycle, like leap of faith sort of thing that's the necessary part of governance and necessary part of doing any kind of prediction in governance. And, something that basically is lost in this kind of like scientific, impartial, objective, trying to predict sort of approach.
One question is, do you think government will freely relinquish a very central system of financing to decentralized? What kind of system of government could be brewing with cryptocurrency?
Yeah, it's very, oh yeah, I should have been reading the questions. That's fine. It's very questionable that government has control of finance today. I would say there's like a sort of parallel international like legal order associated with finance that isn't in the hands of government control, and in fact, like governments are sort of like subject to their rule of law. Like they have to have like balanced budgets, their trades, their like bonds kit, like reflect their credit worthiness. They have like they buy insurance on this stuff, and I doubt that. I don't think it's actually super centralized right now. Although of course, for many people, I mean it is centralized. It's just not the government who is like in control. It's like the international financial community and their compliance and best practices, etc. And they're sort of like informal, private, international legal arrangements. And I think that is centralized in some way, but just not by the government. And of course, they're not trying to relinquish that position. And it's one of these, super important fights that sort of is happening, and it's going to continue to heat up, and is a major issue in blockchain governance today. That's the financial regulation issue.
Yay. And the final question is, how does consultation work in large distributed systems? Like when you want to convince people that there's a change that is necessary, Brett asks, how does one actually do it when you have a distributed system?
So it's very similar to how it's done anywhere else, which is basically like, okay, there's like some people you need to tell before you publish it, and then you publish it, and then you try to get basically a review, comments, feedback, convince in public. And so basically there's like a political unveil until publishing, where you tell people in the right order before you reveal to everyone, and then you sort of hope that everyone is going to agree with it. And basically there's like a discourse that happens, and it's impossible to predict with total certainty, like what's going to come up and what sort of adversaries you'll find. And basically, like, normally if you manage the release correctly, you're able to have a political coalition that supports it, that is able to sort of like deal with any opposition. But a lot of ifs, and often it happens that like there's going to be another political coalition that forms to block you, and you have to sort of like do a kind of like arguing in order to get them to like dissolve and to not block.
Yes, thank you now so much for taking the extra time to answer the questions of the community. I'm glad you spoke up and said, "Hey, stop! cannot stop. We have to listen and speak with the audience here." So thank you all for being here today. Thank you, Vlad, very much for sharing your insights and triggering a train of thoughts in us. At least for me, I have to think a lot and try to process and contextualize all that I learned today in the bigger picture of things. Have a good one, everyone, and see you again tomorrow for coaching and Thursday for another mentoring session. Bye-bye.